Welcome back, everybody. Today we're actually going to be starting our next topic. This one is going to deal with 3 decades in American history in which the country is experiencing some pretty significant changes, changes that are still having ripple effects that we can feel today in many ways. These are decades also that might be a little bit more familiar to people, partially because some of the popular culture that is created during these times is still available and is still sort of recognizable. These are also decades when family members of yours probably had experiences of their own, right? This is a time when you're going to get more into sort of the years when your parents or grandparents are sort of active and aware and maybe sharing stories of what they lived through and that kind of thing. So it is potentially going to be a little bit more recognizable, maybe a little bit more familiar to some of you. There's also another point that I want to bring up, and that is we've talked about a couple topics recently, the Cold War and the Civil Rights era, that have sort of overlapped with the decades that we're dealing with here. That's because I dealt with those as individual sort of standalone topics. The reality is that, especially for something like the Cold War, for instance, that lasts for 45 years, really, from the mid-1940s all the way to about 1990. So I treated it as its own topic in many ways, but there will be things that we will go into in this section that will certainly overlap with that. So I just don't want people to get confused or unclear about the chronology that's involved or anything like that. So if you do have questions, please feel free to let me know. I'm here to help, and make sure that you're reviewing the full PowerPoints on Blackboard. Make sure that you are keeping on top of the other recorded lectures as well. So, okay, so without further ado, we will go ahead and move into the 1950s, first off by talking a little bit about the 1940s. So during the 40s, the United States committed virtually all of its efforts and resources to World War II. And what this means is the economy is geared so much towards producing war materials that people can't buy sort of normal consumer items, things like kitchen appliances or household appliances or cars or any of those kinds of things. This means that people are making a lot of money, whether it is because of their work in factories and their work on the home front, or whether it's their service in the military, but they don't have really anywhere to spend it because there's nothing really available for them to buy. And this means that they come out of the war with a lot of disposable income. You also have a couple of population changes, right? You have the baby boom, where millions and millions of kids are being born in the, say, 15 years or so after the end of World War II. This means that families have more mouths to feed, they have children that they need to provide, clothing or diapers, or they need bigger houses, or whatever the case may be. So you have a lot of population changes just in terms of more people in the country, which is going to contribute to a certain amount of sort of economic expansion. You also have the movement of people around the United States, and this is something that I've mentioned in previous sections, things like the Great Migration, right? The movement of especially African Americans out of southern states primarily and into northern, midwestern, eastern states and cities. This is partially to find new jobs. This is partially to experience the sort of relatively more open opportunities politically and economically and socially that exist in those areas as opposed to the South. And so there are improvements in the quality of life, the standard of living then for minority populations. But these, in some cases, are a little bit behind the curve in terms of what whites are experiencing, and in some cases, even when compared to what women are experiencing around the same time. But it is certainly a significant sort of development. There is also then a noticeable kind of change in where people are living during the 1950s especially. So right after World War II, there's the emergence of sort of pre-packaged suburban communities. These are being built around cities like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and then gradually moving into the Midwest. And part of what's going on is a desire for a lot of growing middle-class families to have more space, to have more sort of, I don't want to say country living, because these suburbs certainly are not country living, but when compared to living in inner cities and that sort of thing, it's definitely a different kind of an experience. And around the same time, into the 1950s, the government begins to construct the Interstate Highway system. So the interstates that we use today are a result of a several decades long program of massive construction that contributes to the ability for people to live outside of city centers. This is going to have a significant impact on the automobile industry, right? As people are living in suburbs, they need some way to get back and forth, whether it's to work or whether it's to sort of cultural opportunities that exist in cities, or whatever the case may be. And suburbs typically have sort of distance between the residents and the shopping areas, right? If you live in an inner city, traditionally you're going to be near the kinds of retail facilities that you need in order to buy food or clothing or what have you. That's not the case when you live in the kinds of suburbs that are growing up in the 40s and 50s. And so city centers then start to decay in many ways because people aren't living there, retail establishments aren't making a profit, they're not able to maintain themselves. So they end up sort of eroding away. And some cities manage to recover. Sometimes it takes quite a while for that to happen. Other cities, not so much. There's also the impact on poor neighborhoods, oftentimes minority neighborhoods. These are the regions in the communities and in the cities that are oftentimes demolished in an effort to build these interstates and build these highways. This is also going to contribute then to challenges in terms of housing opportunities or housing availability for minority populations when compared to the housing opportunities available for white populations and especially middle and upper class populations. Lots of different kinds of changes taking place as a result of sort of individual actions that we may not necessarily always recognize the sort of cause and effect connections going on here. There's also culturally a really interesting kind of development in the sort of recognition, or I guess in one sense you could call it the invention of the idea of adolescence and teenagers. So we take for granted today the idea that there is a period in a person's life cycle between about 12 and 20 years old or so that involves a number of different physical changes, a number of different socialization changes, so on and so forth. That was not always the case. For many, 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 many years, people were either children or they were adults. So the period of transition of adolescence or the teenage years, that's something that is really, for the most part, a 20th century kind of development. And so in the 1950s especially, not to say that this hadn't been going on in small ways before, but certainly by the 1950s, corporate America begins to recognize this large sort of bulge of youth as a potential market, a consumer market. And so they begin targeting teenagers who have a certain amount of income, whether it's an allowance or maybe they've got a job, targeting teenagers as potential consumers for a new type of youth culture, whether this is motion pictures, whether this is in clothing and fashion, whether this is automobiles, and then the kinds of sort of customization that you can do with cars, whatever it might be. And so this is really the first time when you start to notice the emergence of a culture that is designated specifically for young people. And probably the most famous example of this would be rock and roll. So rock and roll is a deliberate kind of co-optation of what had existed for decades as rhythm and blues music in the black community, that increasingly is going to be sort of repackaged in order to appeal to a wider white audience and also appeal to the parents of the younger generation. And so new technologies like transistor radios or 45 RPM records, sort of small records that can hold a couple songs on each side of the disc, these are going to help propel this new music, and then the broader culture that's associated with it, propel it into prominence. And so this is going to help provide a sort of a touchstone for the youth population to say, this is my music, this is how I define myself, as opposed to my parents or my grandparents who listen to different music, who have different ways of dressing, who have different ways of talking, and so on and so on. And so this kind of development is going to begin the ball rolling of having what by the 1960s was known as the generation gap, where young people perceive themselves as a more distinct part of the overall population, and then increasingly kind of define their behaviors and define their existence accordingly. So we'll come back to the issue of youth culture when we get into the 1960s, and also when we get into the 1980s and 90s as well. Excuse me. Politically speaking, we talked a little bit about Eisenhower when we were doing the Cold War. His presidency, he serves for 2 terms in the 1950s, pretty much dominates the 1950s. It doesn't really exist as a cultural phenomenon in the way that his successors will. So John F. Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson, who will take office after Kennedy's assassination, they represent very different kinds of politicians, certainly different from Eisenhower, also very different from one another. Kennedy is a fascinating figure in many ways, partially because the mystique, sort of the legend of John F. Kennedy, in some ways overshadows the reality of Kennedy's presidency. He wins a very, very close election against Richard Nixon in the election of 1960. I've got the Electoral Map on the next slide to show just how close this was. Partially, he wins because he is able to really navigate the world of television much better than Nixon was. So Nixon had a very long public service record. He had been in the House of Representatives in the 1940s. He had been Eisenhower's vice president. So he had quite a bit of political experience and quite a bit of sort of qualification for the job. But Nixon was not terribly comfortable in sort of the role of a politician in terms of dealing with the public, and certainly not comfortable with presenting himself as sort of a confident but yet easygoing and self-assured individual. So this is the first election when there are debates, presidential debates, that are televised. And during these debates, especially in the very first one, Nixon comes across as sort of anxious and extremely nervous. He is, his makeup is not very well applied, it's not very well done. He's suffering from the flu, so he has a bit of a fever. He doesn't come across visually as a very composed individual. Kennedy, on the other hand, is very polished. He's very at ease, very confident in his demeanor. And so it's a fascinating thing that studies were done immediately following the televised debates that asked people who watched the debate which candidate won the debate. And almost to a person, they said that Kennedy won the debate if they watched it on TV. However, if they just listened to it on the radio, most people said that Nixon won the debate, because their perception was based on the answers and the approach to policy questions that the two candidates had. And Kennedy's were a little bit more fuzzy, they were a little bit more vague. Nixon's were a little bit more targeted and focused. And yet the perception of one candidate versus the other ends up contributing, at least partially, to Kennedy's ultimate victory. While he is in office, the White House becomes this kind of youthful, very vibrant, vigorous kind of symbol of the nation. Excuse me. Part of this is due to the efforts of his wife, who works very hard to sort of balance the political side of the presidency with the public sort of performance side of the presidency. And Kennedy then there are pictures and you know, news footage of him playing football on the White House lawn or going sailing off of the coast of Massachusetts and Maine, excuse me, and these kinds of things. He presents then this very youthful, energetic kind of figure. He is the youngest president ever to be elected to office. And so he's sort of adopted in some ways by this sense of youth culture that sees themselves as inheriting the world and being ready to propel the world into the future. But the reality of Kennedy personally is he suffers from some very serious physical ailments, chronic conditions that mean that a lot of that appearance was a result of heavy medication. There were times when he was almost debilitated from pain. And his legislative successes are fairly few and far between in many ways. He has certainly a reputation for a presence as president, but the realities of what he accomplishes as president don't necessarily always live up to that sort of iconic status in some respects. And here's the electoral map. You can see, if you look at the pie charts on the right, the popular vote in particular, Kennedy wins by about 120,000 votes, right, scattered across the entire country. So out of 68, nearly 69 million votes that are cast, Kennedy wins by an extremely small margin. It is probably the smallest margin in the popular vote, at least, in American electoral history. The Electoral College is somewhat more comfortable. He wins 303 to Nixon's 219, but it is still not as cut and dried a victory as, again, sort of the Kennedy mystique might sort of let on. Kennedy, though, is certainly embroiled in a number of events in American sort of foreign policy history that are going to be significant, and especially in terms of his decision to get the United States more involved in Vietnam. He is also connected directly to America's relationship with Cuba. We talked in the Cold War material about the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. That is certainly one of the most significant moments of the Kennedy administration, certainly one of the most significant moments of the Cold War and of the 1960s. Kennedy also is connected directly with this sort of lesser known moment where the American CIA is responsible for arranging this really ridiculous scheme to use Cuban expatriates and Cuban rebels in the country itself to try to overthrow the Castro administration. It ends up being a complete fiasco. Kennedy gets egg on his face as a result of, kind of following through with this. It was not his decision. It wasn't his plan. It had been developed under Eisenhower, and Kennedy just puts it in motion. But it ends up sort of blowing back on Kennedy as a result. And because of some of these early sort of failures in the Cold War, the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, believes that Kennedy is sort of weak-kneed, that he isn't somebody that is much of a sort of a threat, politically, diplomatically speaking, for the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet leadership decides that they're going to kind of press the issue, right? So they begin to escalate tensions and escalate some of their rhetoric, especially surrounding the question of Berlin. And so it's not a coincidence that during the Kennedy administration, the Russians end up building the Berlin Wall, right? Officially and physically dividing the city of Berlin between East and West sections. Kennedy is also the person that really starts the ball rolling towards America's involvement in Vietnam. The U.S. had an interest in the affairs of Vietnam all the way back into the 1940s. During the 1950s, Vietnam is fighting to gain its independence from France. And it was a French colony for 100 years or so by that point. In the 1950s, the French try mightily to hold on to their colonial empire around the world. Vietnam is one of the areas that France is clinging to desperately to try to maintain its empire. The United States will aid France's efforts for a number of different reasons. But essentially, what happens at the end of this process in 1954 is an agreement that Vietnam will be separated into two halves, pending an election that will determine what the government will be for a unified Vietnam. The United States decides that it will support the southern part of Vietnam because the northern part is communist. And so the United States will, against the sort of decisions of the international community and against the agreement that the Vietnamese have entered into, the United States will prop up a quote-unquote independent southern Vietnam. Kennedy is the one that really commits American resources towards that effort, whether it is contributing military advisors, as they're known, people that are there to kind of train the South Vietnamese army, whether it is diplomatic support, whether it's financial support. The Kennedy administration really emphasizes America's commitment to, as they say, preserving South Vietnam. Again, this is, if you're looking at the letter of the treaties that had been signed, this is essentially illegal. But this is part of that Cold War belief that the dangers of communism sort of override the potential ethical scruples of behaving in ways like this. A part of what's going on here is an expression of what's known as the Domino Theory. And the Domino Theory really dominates American diplomatic thinking in the 1960s especially. Basically it says, if one little country becomes communist, then all of the little countries that surround it are at risk, and they will eventually fall to communism too. And as they fall, then the momentum of communism and the size of the sort of communist world will just get bigger and bigger and bigger until the point when there are so many communist countries in the world that the non-communist countries in the world will be outnumbered, they'll be outgunned, and they won't be able to resist communists' expansion to the point of taking over the entire planet. So the domino theory is really at the heart of the kind of justification for American actions in Vietnam, saying if the United States allows South Vietnam to become communist, then all of the neighboring countries, Cambodia and Laos and Thailand and Burma and Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia, right, they will all start to become communist over time. And so the domino theory ends up creating this sort of clouded vision, this clouded perspective of foreign affairs in which American diplomats and American politicians assume that every single independence movement or nationalist effort in any country, anywhere, is immediately an example of this longer-term plan or threat of communism gobbling up smaller and then bigger countries everywhere on the planet. So again, this is really right at the core of America's actions in Vietnam, believing that propping up sort of unethically or borderline illegally propping up this South Vietnam regime, even as unpopular as it is, even among South Vietnamese people, it's unpopular. Propping up that regime is going to prevent one more domino from falling. And if you can stop that next domino, then you can stop that process completely. Eisenhower has this in the back of his mind, Kennedy certainly, and Johnson goes really kind of full speed ahead in terms of escalating and advancing America's involvement in the war. But that's something that we will get into in the next section, right, the next recording. So Kennedy gets this process started in Vietnam. Kennedy, as we mentioned in the civil rights material, Kennedy proposes some different civil rights legislation. He does some things that are going to certainly kind of point in a particular direction for his administration, but he is not as popular a president among leadership in his own party as we might imagine. He's kind of like Abraham Lincoln that way, right? We imagine Abraham Lincoln as being this sort of superstar president. And at the time of Lincoln's life, he's not terribly popular among Republicans. Kennedy is kind of in the same boat. There are a lot of Democrats that don't really care for John F. Kennedy, and a lot of them are in the South. So in the fall of 1963, Kennedy decides that he's going to take a tour, especially of Texas, to try to sort of glad hand Democratic leadership in the state, to try to get them back on board so that he can hopefully rely on carrying Texas for the 1964 election. While he is in Dallas as part of this sort of whirlwind trip, he is assassinated, and pretty much immediately thereafter, Lyndon Johnson takes the oath of office. The photograph in the top right there is Lyndon Johnson on board Air Force One, with President Kennedy's widow standing right next to him, just moments after Kennedy's casket was loaded onto the airplane. So Johnson takes the oath of office, and he inherits a lot of the Kennedy mystique, and he also inherits a fair amount of Kennedy's sort of unfulfilled agenda. Some of that Johnson decides to incorporate into his personal political agenda, but some of it he decides he's going to either expand or he's going to begin to introduce his own ideas about expanded social programs. So Johnson is very much a sort of an inheritor of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, right? Johnson was a powerful congressman during Roosevelt's presidencies, and Johnson is committed to the idea of expanding some of the Roosevelt program. And so this includes programs that in some cases still exist, whether it's Medicaid and Medicare, whether it's the Job Corps, Head Start. So he's concerned with poverty, he's concerned with education, he's concerned with nutrition issues. The problem, though, that Johnson faces is, on the one hand, he is committed to trying to expand the sort of responsibility of the government to provide support resources in a number of different areas. This is known as the Great Society, or the War on Poverty. But Johnson is also committed increasingly to a much larger role in Vietnam. And the problem here is he can't have both. Financially, he can't achieve both of those goals. His reputation, his credibility really begins to suffer as a result of what's happening in Vietnam, and this undermines his ability to get some of those Great Society programs off the ground. And in some cases, it undermines the ability of some of those programs to really sort of solidify. So that's going to be the direction that we will go in our next recording. I apologize, some of these are going to be a little bit longer than our usual time, so more in the 30-35 minute range. So I appreciate your patience. I appreciate you bearing with this. The next recording then will talk about the Johnson presidency and what kinds of things are going on, especially dealing with the Vietnam War and then the anti-war movement and the kind of student movement that emerges in connection with that. And then in our third session, we're actually going to deal with the Nixon presidency and the aftermath of Nixon's resignation as a result of the Watergate scandal and that kind of thing. So let me know if you've got questions about any of this material. I'm here to help. Review the full PowerPoints on Blackboard. Make sure that you're listening to the other recordings, and I hope you're all having a really good day. I wish you all the very best, and I will see you soon.